Hi everyone, I'm Brennan Eaheart, and today my presentation is going to be on 2020 election subversion, specifically the 2020 election fraud hoax. And just as a forward, I'd like to say that this policy is a little untraditional in comparison to our other policy solutions in this class because the solutions to it aren't really legislation. They're more of it's more of a social cultural issue. There aren't really like material harms necessarily, except in couple instances, but going forward, it's much more of a what does this mean for our rights and justice type of issue. So for a breakdown of how this presentation is going to go, I'm going to start with an introduction, the context of the problem, sources and effects, the history of it, and then different popular opinions on the topic. I'm going to move on to current policy actions, how Trump has done it, how Biden's approached it, look at different government agencies and their branches and their jurisdictions on the topic, take a look at the stakeholders and whether or not these major players are opposed to solutions or in favor of solutions to the issue. And then I'm going to look at alternative policies and give my recommendations for the future. So to start, what is 2020 election subversion? Really, 2020 election subversion is kind of a two-pronged thing. The first major thing with it is that it's a hoax. It was a hoax started by former President Donald Trump that the 2020 presidential election was stolen from him and manipulated to make Biden win. And this is on several different grounds that I'll get into in a little bit. There's a lot of claims in a whole lot of different ways. It's very much a broad push, an attack on all fronts to support that kind of an idea. There's not one specific way in which Trump has claimed or Trump supporters have claimed that Biden won. It's very spread out. But why should you care about this? Who does this affect? It affects all U.S. citizens, but voters especially. The fraud claims that voters were disenfranchised because, a false president won. But really, the hoax itself is actually an attempt to do just that. That's really why it's a two-pronged issue. The second part is that the fraud itself is trying to subvert the real democracy and the real democratic presidential election. And why did this hoax happen? It happened because Donald Trump, being in the office of the president, has tremendous power, and anything you say when you're the president of the United States really has a lot of gravitas and weight. And so you can pretty much just say really anything if you're the president of the United States, and definitely people are going to believe you. You're a very important public figure. Where is it taking place? The hoax involves hundreds of different claims of fraud. Largely the claims about it were, broadcasted over social media, but there are also claims on Fox News or any conservative media outlet, articles, newspapers. It's spread everywhere. And how does it manifest? The probably peak of that manifestation so far has been the Capitol riot on January 6th. 10 people have died as a result of that, either 2 directly from injuries, and then the 8 police officers that committed suicide. It might have been 3 and 5, but a lot of deaths have been linked to this because of the polarization and violence that these claims have spurred on. So again, the main contention is that the 2020 election was rigged in favor of Joe Biden, and this claim was supported by saying that there was instances of mail fraud, of vote count fraud, of dead voters, and of rigged voting machines. And these claims were then backed up by a bunch of lawsuits and legal inquiries launched by Trump and his team following the results of the election to basically say, hey, look, this is real. We're fighting it in the courts. And later on, Trump has claimed that he's won 2/3 of these fraud lawsuits. Although, you look back at independent verification, it says he's won only one of these and lost or had other 50 lawsuits thrown out of the 60-odd claims that he's launched. Some of them are still waiting to be held or heard or have a ruling on them. There's a lot of different stuff going on, but overall, he has not won 2/3 of the election fraud lawsuits, as well as, in actuality, pretty much 0 of these actually allege fraud. None of these lawsuits are saying, hey, look, we believe that Joe Biden stole the election. We believe that the Democrats launched a major campaign to add dead voters onto the Georgia vote count. Instead, they're making small inquiries, are basically saying, hey, you didn't follow the proper voting procedures to a T. Oh, there's some minor problems with how you handled voting, or maybe you closed too early at the polls, or the boxes or the ballots weren't secured in this sort of a way. So they're kind of challenging election procedures or alleging like minor issues. They're not actually claiming fraud. And then again, more context. The fraud and the first claims of actual fraud were kicked off by Donald Trump in November after the 2020 election. He's had claims like, frankly, we did win this election. You'll never take back our country with weakness. He said that during a speech before the January 6th Capitol riot. And he's had comments earlier than the 2016 presidential election showing, as early as the 2016 presidential election, showing a history of fraud and supporting fraudulent behavior. He claimed after the 2016 presidential election that he would have won the popular vote if you deducted the millions of people who voted illegally, basically claiming that there was a bunch of fraud going on back then. And, you know, even back in 2011, he made claims when he was making his foray into politics of Obama's birth certificate being false and, you know, blowing up those claims. So again, the main source of this is Donald Trump. Sure, it's also supported by his supporters, but really it's him being the president, being, you know, the other person who lost the race. He's the main agent of spreading this claim. And he did so over social media and over news networks. On the right, I have a bunch of different quotes that all directly allege fraud. And this is reinforced by his supporters, his organization, and the media, resulted in protests, violence, and caused more polarization and increased the partisan divide. The graphic there is from the Pew Research Center. It's basically just showing how the divide among Democrats and among Republicans of how they view each other has grown. And on the next page, I have more effects on the people, basically just showing you that this is one of several events that have massively increased polarization in the country. A very big effect, considering we're a democracy and we kind of have to work together to do anything. So the legislative history of election fraud is not really existent. Almost no elections in the past 50 years have been flipped because of documented voter fraud, with occasional exceptions at the local level. And that's from an article from the Associated Press, basically looking at right after the 2020 election, like examining Trump's claims and then looking at like, okay, has this ever happened in America before? And it really hasn't. The article continued that basically the decentralized system of American elections makes it almost impossible for this type of widespread fraud to happen. And the U.S. Election Assistance Commission itself has, you know, said that they believe it's almost impossible to steal a nationwide election through voter fraud, especially with zero evidence, as was the case for Trump's claims. In terms of our voting structure, we've had several key changes, like the Australian ballot, like allowing you to actually not just vote along a partisan line, vote for whoever you want to that's actually running for it, you know, dismantling of political machines. So if anything, over the history, we've definitely made it more and more and more significantly unlikely for any voter fraud to happen, let alone massive voter fraud that would change an election like that, which is claims to have happened by Trump. There's also been the history of gerrymandering, which has not gone away. Some may argue plays into voter fraud in the sense that it depowers your vote. But again, if anyone was a victim of gerrymandering, you could argue that it would be Joe Biden. But both parties have really been using gerrymandering for the longest time. There's not really any connection there to Trump's claims. So right now, the current history is that Trump faces a bunch of cases for his claims, although they're not necessarily any claims that he himself has tried to subvert the election. They're mostly just claims of fraud. He faces a case for incitement of violence for the January 6th protest and riot. He also has a case for meddling in the 2020 Georgia election and civil fraud case. He launched his 50-plus lawsuits, but the overwhelming majority actually failed to actually allege fraud. And there was a lawsuit against Dominion Voting Systems, which was and is a big provider of different voting computers and machines to the U.S. Because of claims made on Fox News that they were, hacked and massively frauded. And Dominion was awarded $787 million in a settlement with Fox News when they actually sued them for defamation following those claims in 2020. Popular opinions. So Democrats largely believe that there was no widespread voter fraud, citing overwhelming evidence in their favor and the lack of evidence of any fraud coming from Trump's side. And many are largely angry about January 6th and want to see Trump face proper justice in a court of law. Republicans actually don't largely believe that the entire election was stolen. Trump supporters and his sect of MAGA Republicans do believe in that, although conservatives broadly believe that there may have been election fraud or meddling in it. They're not necessarily completely, not all conservatives and Republicans are specifically in the MAGA camp, specifically in the Joe Biden stole the election, although broadly the Trump supporters are. And then these two graphics in the Pew Research Center are just evidence of these opinions. So for the administrative approaches, Trump and his administration didn't really do anything about voter fraud. He hadn't made at least claims of 2020 election fraud because that didn't happen until the very end, when he didn't really have any time to actually do anything with his presidential power about it. But the important thing to note is that he's the first former president ever indicted of a crime. Past have been close. You had the Watergate scandal. They've been implicated or alleged, but not actually formalized, although obviously he was not indicted when he was a sitting president, because that's not currently, precedent says that that's not possible, that presidents are immune to that. But this is kind of uncharted waters. There's a lot of questions raised by this about presidential power, especially when Trump was still the president making all these claims. Like, can he actually stop the election? Can he just say, no, I'm going to be the president forever now? It was a very scary situation, and there's a lot of moral questions as well about the trials against him, considering he's still eligible to be president again. He's still a very popular presidential candidate. You look at Iowa, he's massively ahead of all the other Republicans in the polls. There's a lot of questions about, is that kind of partisan to attack him? As well as that, he supported the Heritage Foundation plans, which are to fire as many as 50,000 federal workers. That's from their own website. The Heritage Foundation, they're looking at replacing people in government agencies and bureaucracies that are to become like partisan agents. the problem with that, or at least that's the only other policy that I can really consider to affect this, is that there are things like the FEC, there are things like the EAC, and then other boards that advise election policy, because even though election policy is not a nationwide federally mandated thing, there are federal boards that help in certain ways. If he was to go through with that and like obliterate these agencies, there's a lot of questions about what would he be able to do with this sort of new partisan aligned bureaucracies towards elections. And for Biden, Biden doesn't really have any active policy besides maintaining legal precedent, so he's not like pardoned Trump for any of the things. Trump's still got all of his indictments. That being said, Biden is not really spearheading like a campaign against Trump, despite these sort of claims. You know, one of the judges for one of the cases against Trump was appointed by the Biden administration, but that's not necessarily the longest connection. I mean, if he's a sitting president, he's going to appoint all the judges he can. Trump certainly did in his term. State legislatures currently under, in Biden's presidency, a lot of state legislatures have been implementing and looking at new security laws for bills just to try and dissuade those that believe that there was election fraud. But these aren't really a solution to the problem, because 2020 election fraud hoax is mainly in the minds of people. Like shoring up any concerns or any like minor issues in the electoral process are not going to convince these diehard MAGA people that their election was not stolen and that their vote doesn't count. For the government jurisdiction, again, I kind of mentioned it, the FEC doesn't have federal oversight like over elections. It only covers campaign finance laws. State agencies are really where election voting regulations are determined. The FBI and the DHS, they do have a part to play. There's an arguable threat to national security should voting in elections be compromised, or should presidents become tyrants. And in the Dominion voting case, there was a Haldeman report by Dr. Haldeman, who was a computer science professor, and the state of Georgia itself had a big part to play in refuting his claims of, major problems with the Dominion voting system, citing that the problems that he was saying were unrealistic to ever be actualized. In terms of Congress, they passed the National Voter Registration Act in 1993, which created voter registration and added more protections to voting. But this has been around long before any of these sort of fraud claims, but this is kind of just a background. There's the Help America Vote Act in 2002. It provided funding for states to update election processes and equipment, and again, ensure safer elections. And then there's also the EAC, which is a federal body that provides guidance and assistance to state agencies in running and securing their elections. So they have some play here in any sort of new laws that could concern this. And then the courts are really the only major government body that actually matter here. They've got all these Trump cases. The courts have opportunity to make new legal precedent, as charges against Trump are historical firsts. There's the enforcement of voting laws. The courts determine the application of the laws. So we're going to see how these laws shape up against a former president, and it might very well set the precedent that, like, hey, no, if you're a president, you can't be claiming that you won the election, because you're going to end up going to jail like Trump did. But we'll have to see. And then again, the Dominion lawsuit definitely helped set and add a lot more merit to the, hey, there wasn't voting fraud, right? Look at what happened with Dominion, and they went through the courts and they settled for $787 million. Stakeholders here, you've got government. Government largely, through all the government bodies, would be in support of any sort of solution towards ending the 2020 election hoax. Democracy is important for government jobs. If you're in a bureaucracy, you'd definitely be concerned over Heritage Foundation plans, as well as national security should someone be able to maintain power after they've lost an election. Democrats largely support solutions to this. It's mainly a Republican effort in the first place. They're naturally going to be opposed to it. There's a fear of subversion of future elections, concerns over threats to democracy, and it delegitimizes Biden. It really hurts his possible chances for re-election. Republicans are going to be opposed to solutions on this. A lot of them believe Trump's claims, but there's also a willingness to allow it to happen because of the advancement of conservative policies, regardless of the damage to the democratic process. There's the belief that Trump charges are a partisan attack against him, and so even if they don't believe in the 2020 election fraud hoax, there is the very real camp that thinks that Trump should get away scot-free, and he could very well likely then win the election again. Public opinion generally is in support of it. This is because the MAGA people are really the only people that are super diehard. We believe the 2020 election fraud hoax happened. A lot of people, most people, definitely agree that it didn't happen and that it removes agency, right? It takes away from their own vote should claims like that actually go on to result in people maintaining power. It delegitimizes the elections, and generally in America, people value and have a reverence for precedent, law, and democracy, and that kind of goes against all those things. In terms of interest groups, there's really mixed interest group opposition and support on this topic. Those with something to gain, like Fox News, generally supported it, right? They reported on claims of election fraud, right? They broadcasted false information about Dominion voting. There's the Heritage Foundation, again, which is very much aligned with Trump in supporting that because it goes against supporting conservative values. Democratic-aligned interest groups generally don't support it because, again, they want their politicians that are already lobbied for on the Democrat side to win, and this is very much a Republican effort. So alternative policy solutions, there are a couple. There's the idea of the extension of constitutional protections to the internet. So the fraudulent claims were spread chiefly through Twitter and Facebook, and Trump was banned on social media as a result. There's an idea that and a belief that maybe we should have the freedom of speech and all these other speech laws, including like slander and libel, be enforceable over internet forums. And so we'd be able to prosecute Trump for stuff that he said specifically on Twitter and everything, considering he did have certain claims thrown out because a lot of he had certain charges against him dropped because a lot of the evidence came from things that he had said or his groups had said online, which wasn't necessarily something that they could actually use. Federal oversight of information is another thing. In the U.S., there's a history. The FCC had been a big part in radio and television, really controlling things. We used to only have 3 news networks that were pretty limited and kind of just reported in the same direction and were bipartisan. Nowadays, we have way more partisan, polarized media, and so solutions for way more federal oversight of information and like facts would definitely alleviate the problem. And there's also concerns about the future of political prosecution. So some people believe that we definitely should be persecuting everybody that had anything to do with this. And that would definitely possibly be an alternative solution to just jail all these people that made these claims. And to look at a cost-benefit analysis of these in terms of prosecution, which is the current one, the pros are it follows the current laws. Trump may have committed laws. He hasn't been fully found guilty yet, but we're going through the courts. We're going through the current processes. We're doing everything that's already been in motion, trying to seek justice for wrongs. It's not necessarily a super controversial thing, at least on a legal level, but from a perspective of political parties, it can be very controversial and polarizing because you're trying to jail someone who is going to possibly be president, right? He could very well win the 2024 election and then have these cases still going on and result. What happens then? Will Trump, if Trump wins the election and then they find out that, oh yeah, he's actually should get 20 years in jail, how is that going to play out? So that can be a really scary and problematic issue. In terms of information, the information solution, this kind of removes all suspicion of like a partisan agenda because, again, we're not going to jail Trump. We're not really attacking any people on the Republican side. We're just like shoring up what's enabled to be allowed to be spread on social media. But it's likely not enough, especially if it's just an information campaign that just like says like, hey, this is the facts. Because again, it's kind of already been happening and it hasn't made much of an impact. As time has gone on, statistics show that even though more and more Trump indictments have landed and more evidence is piled against him, he's still climbed more and more higher in polls for the next election. So it doesn't seem like an information campaign would really work. In terms of media control, so outright stricter control of anything being spread on these networks or on news media, it kind of destroys precedent. Really, it would take away from corporate autonomy. It doesn't seem like something that would be able to be done without really damaging our government, our democracy in a way harder way than these fraud claims have. And then in terms of government reform, it's likely to be the most successful. It would prohibit such behaviors and would likely ensure that someone like Trump would not be able to use claims of fraud to support himself, to maintain an election as a dictator. But this would go against decades of Justice Department policy of, a former president or a sitting president can't be charged in the courts. It definitely runs the risk of destroying executive power, dismantling the balance of power of the government, and would be extremely hard to implement because any sort of change that would like reduce the presidential power to make sure that he can't lie or spread fraudulent claims and this and that would have to be an amendment to the Constitution, which is hard to implement. And so to conclude my personal recommendations, I think the best way forward is to maintain lawsuits and maintain the current legal proceedings surrounding this. It follows the most clear precedent. He's no longer a president. He's a former president. So as far as policy goes, he can be tried. It hasn't been done before, but it's not something that there's something out there saying don't do that or we can't do that. It deters copiers of fraud behavior. After all, something probably has to happen to Trump to stop him from making the claims. If he successfully continues to make the claims without anything happening to him, he's never going to stop. It's in his best interest to keep going. He was banned on social media, but that didn't really work out. He got back on social media. He makes new social media. He speaks only to his partisan people. And then I believe the other thing is to push for safer election laws just to shore up all claims of, belief in the hoax. The computer science professor that made all those claims about Dominion voting was a really bad look, especially when Georgia was a battleground state in the 2020 election, and especially after their initial statement was just that, oh, we don't think that the claims of problems with our voting machines are a really big issue. Those didn't really seem to dissuade anyone that voter fraud didn't happen. And that'll end my presentation. Here's just my sources. I have a bunch of different articles and links for all my quotes, but they're cited on the slides.